the Holocaust, one of history's darkest chapters. It took the lives of 6 million Jews and left scars the world will never erase. But the tragedy didn't end there. Just a few years later, over 700,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes in an event known as the Nakba. At first glance, these two tragedies might seem completely unrelated, one a genocide, the other a mass expulsion. But what if they're more connected than we realize? What if the link isn't religion or ethnicity, but something else entirely? Zionism. In the wake of unimaginable Jewish suffering, Zionist leaders saw an opportunity. While Jewish refugees, people who had barely survived the horrors of the Nazis, were being turned away from safe borders like the SS St. Louis, a ship carrying over 900 desperate souls, Zionist lobbying wasn't focused on finding them shelter anywhere. It was singularly focused on one place, Palestine. But securing this land came at a cost. Another innocent population, Palestinians, would pay the price. To understand how these two catastrophes became so intertwined and how Zionist ambitions shaped Palestine's fate, we need to go back to 1939, a year when the world was on fire, and Zionist leaders saw an opening in the chaos. Before we go any further, let's clear up something that often gets blurred, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. When we talk about Zionism, we're not talking about Judaism. Judaism is a religion, a way of life built on faith, peace, and community. Zionism? That's a political movement, a movement that emerged in the late 19th century, aiming to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. But here's something that rarely gets discussed. Many Jewish voices, some of the most brilliant minds of their time, opposed Zionism, not because they didn't care about Jewish safety, but because they feared what nationalism would bring. Albert Einstein, one of the most famous Jewish figures in history, saw the dangers early on. In 1938, he warned, "I much prefer reasonable agreement with the Arabs on the basis of living together in peace, rather than the creation of a Jewish state." And he wasn't alone. Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher and peace advocate, believed that if Zionism prioritized nationalism over coexistence, it would lead to endless violence. Orthodox Jewish groups, like Neturei Karta, have gone even further, calling Zionism a betrayal of Judaism's teachings. And this wasn't just a matter of philosophy. It was lived reality. Before Zionist political ambitions divided communities, Jewish and Palestinian people lived side by side. And beyond Palestine, Jewish-Arab solidarity existed in powerful ways. One example? King Mohammed V of Morocco. During World War II, when the French Vichy regime tried to enforce Nazi anti-Jewish laws in Morocco, he refused. His response was simple, but powerful. There are no Jews in Morocco, only subjects. While Moroccan Jews weren't facing the same direct threat as European Jews, his stand against racial persecution mattered. And this wasn't an isolated act of kindness. It was part of a broader history, one that Zionist ambitions later sought to erase. But what happens when voices calling for peace are ignored? When nationalism instead of coexistence takes the lead? To answer that, we have to step into World War II, a time when global war, Jewish suffering, and Zionist strategy collided to reshape the fate of Palestine. The Holocaust, one of the darkest stains in human history. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children systematically murdered under Nazi rule. But this was not just a story of genocide, it was also a story of global indifference, political exploitation, and lost opportunities. As Jews were sent to their deaths, Western nations turned them away from their borders. And while survivors searched for safety, powerful Zionist leaders redirected their suffering toward a nationalist goal, one that would displace another people, the Palestinians. The horrors of the Holocaust didn't begin with the gas chambers. They began with policies of exclusion. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their citizenship and rights. Jewish families were rounded up into ghettos, like Warsaw, where overcrowding and starvation killed thousands before they even reached concentration camps. In Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka, millions were murdered in gas chambers, forced labor, and medical experiments. By 1945, nearly 6 million Jews had perished. But the tragedy extended beyond Nazi-occupied Europe. It spread through inaction. In 1938, delegates from 32 nations gathered in Evian, France, to discuss the Jewish refugee crisis. They expressed sympathy, but offered little action. Most, including the US and Britain, cited economic concerns and so-called security risks. Only the Dominican Republic offered to take in a significant number of Jewish refugees. When the SS Louis set sail in 1939, carrying 937 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution, the ship was denied entry to Cuba, the United States, and Canada. Forced to return to Europe, many passengers later perished in Nazi camps. The world closed its doors to us when we needed it most, survivors would later reflect. And that same indifference, combined with opportunism, would come to define the next chapter of this tragedy. As Jewish families suffered, Zionist leaders saw a political opportunity. Their vision for a Jewish state in Palestine intensified during the war. For them, Palestine was not just a refuge, it was the only acceptable destination, regardless of the cost. In 1938, David Ben-Gurion, a key Zionist leader, made his stance clear. If I knew that all the children of Germany could be saved by sending them to England, or only half by sending them to Eretz Israel, I would choose the latter. This wasn't a sentiment shared by all Jews, but for some Zionist leaders, securing a state took priority over saving lives. In 1942, at the Biltmore Conference in New York, Zionist leaders shifted their ambitions from vague hopes to explicit demands, calling for a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. American Zionist organizations unified, strengthening their influence on US policy, but the real turning point came after the war, when Zionist leaders leveraged Western guilt over the Holocaust. During the war, nations like the US and Britain refused to open their borders to Jewish refugees. But now, those same governments endorsed mass Jewish immigration to Palestine. In 1947, US President Harry Truman acknowledged this shift in sentiment, saying, "We have the chance to redeem our mistakes and support the Jewish people in establishing a national homeland." The Holocaust had been weaponized not for justice, but to push a nationalist agenda. Palestinians, who had nothing to do with Nazi crimes, were now collateral damage. While Zionist militias organized illegal immigration, 12,000 Palestinian Arabs volunteered to fight in the British Army, alongside Jewish volunteers, against the Axis powers. They hoped their loyalty would be rewarded with independence. Meanwhile, British policy tried to balance competing demands. The 1939 White Paper limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 over 5 years, aiming to prevent conflict. To Zionist groups, this was a betrayal. To Palestinian Arabs, it was one of the few policies protecting their homeland from mass Jewish settlement. But displacement had already begun. Even during the war, Zionist organizations like the Jewish National Fund were buying land from absentee landlords, evicting Palestinian tenant farmers in the process. The Holocaust was undeniable, the suffering immeasurable, but what followed was not inevitable, it was a choice. Rather than allowing Jews and Palestinians to coexist, political forces used one tragedy to justify another. The world failed to protect the Jews of Europe. Now it would fail the Palestinians of Palestine. As Zionist militias armed themselves and Western powers shifted their focus, the stage was set for the UN partition plan and the catastrophe that would follow, the Nakba. After the Holocaust, the world looked on in horror at what had happened to Europe's Jews. Hundreds of thousands of survivors, many still wearing the striped uniforms of Nazi concentration camps, found themselves stranded in displaced persons camps, stuck in a continent that had just tried to exterminate them. But while major world powers hesitated, a handful of individuals and smaller nations defied inaction. Sweden took in Jewish refugees and granted them protection. Denmark's resistance movement smuggled over 7,000 Jews to neutral Sweden, saving them from Nazi capture. Diplomats like Raoul Wallenberg and Chiune Sugihara risked their lives forging visas, helping thousands escape. The Dominican Republic offered to take in 100,000 Jewish refugees, though only a fraction made it due to logistical challenges. Yet despite these acts of kindness, for most Jewish survivors, borders remained closed, and hope ran out. Palestinians were on the verge of their own displacement, though few realized it at the time. Decisions made far from their homes would soon turn them into refugees in their own land, casualties of shifting global agendas. For many Holocaust survivors, liberation didn't mean freedom. It meant finding themselves locked behind barbed wire once again. Displaced persons camps set up by the Allies were meant to provide temporary refuge. But for many, the conditions were hauntingly familiar. Overcrowded, unhygienic, and lacking medical care, many of these camps were repurposed from former Nazi facilities. Some survivors refused to eat, fearing the food was poisoned. an instinct from years of Nazi starvation tactics. And worst of all, the world was still unwilling to take them in. In 1945 US, investigator Earl G. Harrison toured the camps and issued a damning report. We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. It was an indictment of Western inaction. The same countries that had refused to help Jewish refugees before the war were still reluctant to accept them after, and as global sympathy for these survivors grew, Zionist leaders saw an opportunity. For years, Zionist organizations had worked to secure Palestine as a Jewish homeland, but the scale of Jewish suffering after the war provided them with the most powerful political argument yet. History isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we make today and the truths we choose to see. The Holocaust revealed what happens when the world looks away. Even after liberation, the same silence continued. Jewish survivors were placed in camps. Borders stayed closed. Their pain was repurposed into politics. Leaders didn't seek peace, they saw a chance. They used suffering to push a nationalist project, one that was rejected by many Jews. It had nothing to do with Judaism. This land wasn't empty, it wasn't promised, it was lived in by people who were never asked. The tragedy that followed wasn't inevitable, it was a choice made by those who justified it with guilt. In episode 4, we explore the moment Palestine was divided on paper before it was divided in reality. A moment that changed everything. On Prottayon, we uncover the truths others silence to make space for justice, not erasure. If this episode challenged what you thought you knew, save it, share it, speak it, and learn more from those who've lived and researched this history. Here are voices worth hearing. Breaking from Zionism, a documentary featuring Jewish voices for justice. Free on YouTube. We Need to Talk About Zionism. A media analysis by The Listening. YouTube. A Jewish Approach to Zionism. A clear explainer by Jewish Voice for Peace on their website. Or We Need an Exodus from Zionism, an article by Naomi Klein published in The Guardian. Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, a human rights report by Amnesty International. These aren't just opinions, they're evidence of another side to the story. Find the links below, watch them, share them. Let this be where we change how history is told. Episode 4 is coming soon. With it, a catastrophe the world refused to prevent. The past cannot be undone. But silence, that's a choice we don't have to make again. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, take care of yourselves.